dim red emergency lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the narrow corridor of the Deep Space Research Station. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt wiring and something else. Something organic, metallic, and wrong. Dr. Elena Marquez clutched her pulse rifle tightly, her knuckles white, as she moved cautiously down the hallway. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had read the reports, seen the footage, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of a xenomorph attack. It had started just hours ago. The station, orbiting a distant moon, had been studying a mysterious derelict spacecraft discovered on the surface. The science team had brought a few samples aboard, strange, leathery eggs that seemed almost alive. Elena had warned them. She had argued against bringing the specimens on board, citing every protocol in the book. But curiosity had won out over caution, and now the station was a slaughterhouse. The first sign of trouble had been the power fluctuations. Lights flickering, systems going offline, and then the screams. The Xenomorphs, perfect killing machines, had emerged from the shadows, their sleek, biomechanical bodies moving with terrifying speed and precision. The crew had been unprepared, unarmed, and utterly outmatched. Elena had barely managed to grab a weapon and escape the initial onslaught. Now she was alone, or so she hoped. She paused at a junction, listening intently. The station was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of fluid from the ceiling and the faint hum of the failing life support systems. She knew the Xenomorphs were out there, hunting her. They were patient, intelligent, and relentless. She had to think, to plan, to survive. The first rule of surviving a xenomorph attack was simple. Don't panic. Easier said than done, but panic led to mistakes, and mistakes led to death. Elena forced herself to breathe deeply, to focus. She needed to get to the emergency shuttle bay. It was her only chance of escaping the station alive. But the bay was on the other side of the station, and the Xenomorphs were between her and salvation. She moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the pools of acidic blood that had already eaten through the metal floor. The Xenomorphs' blood was as deadly as their claws and teeth. One wrong step, one careless moment, and she could lose a limb or worse. She had to be smart, methodical. The second rule of survival: know your enemy. Elena had studied everything she could about the Xenomorphs. They were fast, strong, and nearly indestructible. Their exoskeletons could withstand small arms fire, and their acidic blood made them almost impossible to kill without risking your own life. But they weren't invincible. They had weaknesses. They relied on stealth and ambush tactics, which meant they could be outmaneuvered. And they were vulnerable to fire and extreme heat. Elena glanced down at the flamethrower strapped to her back. It was her best weapon against the creatures, but it was also a last resort. The station's oxygen levels were already dangerously low, and using the flamethrower could ignite a fire that would consume what little air remained. She had to use it sparingly, if at all. She rounded a corner and froze. Ahead, the corridor was littered with the remains of her colleagues. Their bodies were twisted and broken, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The sight made her stomach churn, but she couldn't afford to look away. She had to learn from their mistakes. The third rule of survival: don't go alone. Xenomorphs were pack hunters, and they thrived on isolating their prey. Elena knew she couldn't face them alone, but there was no one left to help her. She had to rely on her wits and whatever tools she could scavenge. She moved past the bodies, careful not to disturb them. The last thing she needed was to alert the Xenomorphs to her presence. She reached a maintenance hatch and paused. The shuttle bay was on the other side of the station, but the main corridors were too dangerous. She would have to take the service tunnels. The hatch creaked as she opened it, the sound echoing down the empty corridor. She winced, waiting for the telltale hiss of a xenomorph, but the station remained silent. She slipped inside, closing the hatch behind her. The service tunnel was cramped and dark, the only light coming from her helmet's flashlight. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with pipes and conduits. It was a labyrinth, but it was also her best chance of avoiding the xenomorphs. She moved quickly but quietly, her pulse rifle at the ready. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in every direction. She had to stay focused to keep her bearings. Getting lost in the tunnels would be a death sentence. After what felt like hours, she reached a junction. According to the station schematics, the shuttle bay was just ahead. She could almost feel the weight lifting from her shoulders. She was so close. But then she heard it. A soft, skittering sound, like claws on metal. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, raising her rifle. The xenomorph emerged from the shadows, its sleek black form glistening in the dim light. Its elongated head tilted as it studied her, its inner jaws twitching in anticipation. Elena's finger hovered over the trigger, but she didn't fire. She knew the sound would attract more of them. The creature lunged, its movements impossibly fast. Elena ducked, rolling to the side as its tail whipped past her, slicing through the air. She scrambled to her feet, backing away slowly. The xenomorph hissed, its breath hot and rancid. She had to think fast. The flamethrower was too risky, and the pulse rifle would only buy her a few seconds. She needed a distraction. Her eyes fell on a nearby control panel. She lunged for it, slamming her fist against the emergency override. The station's alarms blared to life, the sound deafening in the confined space. The xenomorph recoiled, its head snapping back in confusion. Elena didn't wait. She turned and ran, her boots pounding against the metal floor. The shuttle bay was just ahead. She could see the doors, the emergency lights flashing red. But the xenomorph was faster. It caught up to her in seconds, its claws slashing at her back. She cried out in pain, stumbling forward. She could feel the blood soaking through her suit, but she couldn't stop. She was so close. She reached the shuttle bay doors and slammed her hand against the control panel. The doors hissed open, and she threw herself inside. The xenomorph was right behind her, its jaws snapping at her heels. She turned, raising the flamethrower. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. She pulled the trigger, and a jet of flame erupted from the nozzle, engulfing the creature in a fiery inferno. The xenomorph screeched, its body writhing in agony as the flames consumed it. Elena kept the flamethrower trained on it until it collapsed, its body twitching and smoldering. She stumbled back, her hands trembling. The shuttle bay was filled with smoke, the air thick with the stench of burning flesh. She had to get out of there. She turned to the shuttle, her vision swimming. The pain in her back was unbearable, but she couldn't stop. She climbed into the shuttle, her fingers fumbling with the controls. The engines roared to life, and the shuttle lifted off, breaking free of the station. As she soared into the void of space, Elena allowed herself a moment of relief. She had survived the xenomorph attack, but at a cost. The station was gone, her colleagues were dead, and she was alone. But she was alive. And for now, that was enough.